Good morning. Good to see each of you today. I hope that you have had a really nice week and looking forward to our service this morning. And we're doing Sunday school in here today because everything's been kind of set up in there, and they would probably kill me if I disturbed anything in there. So that would be a bad thing. But anyway, we are working through a discussion on missions, and so I'm looking forward to picking up where we left off last week. And I think we got through 4 questions last week, so I hope we go a little further than that this time. But if we don't, that's okay. I mean, we'll just work through it as much time as we need. But before we open in prayer, I want to mention a couple of announcements. The first is tonight we do not have an evening service because we will have a lengthy fellowship. And then on Tuesday night, we will have our midweek instead of Wednesday. I know that Wednesday is typically a travel day for a lot of people. And there won't be anybody in the office this week, so if you call the office and leave a message, no one will respond. So I'm just giving you a heads up. We're going to be taking time off. All of us will be taking time off. So please do make sure that you don't come on Wednesday night because it'll be dark and quiet and no one will be here. And but just keep that in mind. And then also we have our leaf raking day on Saturday, and as you can see, there are a lot of leaves on the ground, and Tim has been getting them up already a couple times. He's been here like an entire day working on it, and I think we have more leaves than normal because we had a fairly wet summer. So if you can make it for that, the kids have a blast, and it's a good time, and we usually get them knocked out pretty quick. I would say 10:30, 11, we're pretty much done, and after that, people who want to hang around and play in the leaves are doing that, but we get it knocked out pretty quick. All right, well, let's bow for a word of prayer, and we'll get started this morning. Father, we are so grateful that we can gather together as a church, and we recognize that the continued work in any place is ultimately the result of your grace. And you raise up people, you bring people together, you save people, disciples grow into Christ-likeness. And we are just grateful that today we can remember how kind you are. And I pray that you'll bless our Sunday school time as we discuss questions about missions. I explain a little bit about how missions works in our church and the kinds of things that we look at when we're evaluating missionaries. I pray that this just be a very profitable, encouraging time. We ask it all in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, I want to remind you of where we have been as we've been working our way through this. First of all, we were in Psalm 96, and in Psalm 96 we looked at what I would say is a theology of missions. And when we talk about this issue of missions, first of all, the word missionary is never used in the Bible. The concept of missions is never technically defined in the Scriptures. And so when we talk about missions, there is a sense in which, when you talk about a pastor, you know what the qualifications of a pastor are. You know what the work is that a pastor is supposed to do. You know what's expected of them personally. You know what's expected of them when it comes to their labors. You know what's expected of their families. But when it comes to missions, that's not stated, okay? So when we get into this discussion on missions, there's a lot of subjectivity here. And there are really 2 principles that I think will guide this. Well, really 3. The first principle is theologically, how do we look at missions? And that is where we started, Psalm 96. Then there's a sense where missions is an area of wisdom, okay? When we talk about it being an area of wisdom, what we're saying is there are certain ways that people could be funded that would be better than other ways. There are certain kinds of ministry models that could be better than other ministry models. There would be some ministry models that we could probably say are in principle wrong, and there would be some that could be in principle maybe not super wise, but God works through them and in spite of them, and there could be some that we could say, that's good wisdom right there. Then there are also areas when it comes to missions that are issues of, I would say, conscience. And when we talk about, the people that we take on as a church, there is the theology of missions, there is the wisdom side, and there's the conscience side. And so it could be that those who are in leadership conscientiously cannot support a certain individual, and so that person, though there are people in the congregation who would love to get behind that person, they will not be presented to the congregation. And there could be times that people in the leadership would love to see someone supported, and the conscience of the congregation is binding because we are a Baptist church, meaning that the pastor doesn't dictate, the pastor leads, but the congregation ultimately makes the decisions. That's why we have business meetings. So it's important for us to understand those things when we talk about it. So Psalm 96 emphasizes that God commands all people to worship him. This command is pressing because God is incomparably great. This command is pressing because of the emptiness of false religions. And we also saw that the command is pressing because he will judge the earth. And so on the first day, we dealt with those pieces from Psalm 96 that should really focus our attention on what missions is all about. It's about reaching the nations. Then we got into a questionnaire that we send to people who are prospective missionaries. And as I stated when I mentioned this, these are not necessarily absolutes. Certain aspects of this are absolute. If the Bible speaks very clearly about an issue like qualifications of a pastor, if someone's not qualified to be a pastor, I would not get behind them as a missionary, okay? That's very, very simple. To me, that's extremely objective. But when it comes to some of these other issues, then we're talking about something different. So a lot of this is asking the question, what does this person think about missions? How much have they thought about missions? How prepared are they to go into missions? Is it really prudent for this person at this time to go into missions? These are questions that we are asking. Is their church really behind them? Not, are they like holding their nose while they send them to go do what they're doing, but are they really behind this individual? They say, this is a person that God's hand is upon, they're going to the field, and they're excited about that, and they would encourage you to partner with them. Just because it's a person that really has noble desires and they are good people, if they're philosophically different from our church enough that we really could not partner with them in good conscience, we also have to consider that issue. And I know this is another piece that was kind of touched on in the questions, is, well, what do we do about people that are in more helps-oriented ministries? For instance, when we lived over in Ghana, there were people that did microfinance. They were Christians. They taught people how to start businesses. They actually gave them loans, okay? They had loan officers. They had a structure as to helping them learn how to save, learn how to invest, learn how to write a business plan, all kinds of details. You say, is that missions? I say, no, it's not missions in the sense that we look at missions, but is that a good thing? Absolutely, it's a good thing. There's a place for it. But the truth is that microfinance ministry has to really be set up like a business. And they probably should be primarily supported by businesses. You know, if a church is giving them $200 or $400 or $500 and they need $100,000 worth of assets to be able to help people start businesses, well, I mean, they're going to be saving money or trying to raise money to go to the field for a very long time. Whereas when we send out a church planter, we're sending out someone who we're essentially supporting someone like we support our pastor. And they're going and doing the work of the ministry. And so there's a difference between what we could say is local church ministry, which is very clearly defined in the Bible, and what we would say is essentially a nonprofit business-oriented model where people are going to be channeling funds probably from businesses and places like that. So I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. Even when we talk about a Christian school really is run like a business, a nonprofit business. But if a church is supporting a school, then that church is financially going to just break eventually. And so a lot could be said there, but I'll just keep moving from that. Okay, so I want to pick up where we left off last time, and here is the question, and you're going to have to kind of move your way through the PowerPoint. But the question is, do you believe a missionary church planter should pastor one ministry that will function as a long-term mother church, or work from the church's birth to turn it over entirely to well-qualified national pastors? Now, that question really is asking, what philosophy of ministry do you have when it comes to church planting between one of two basic options? One would be what we call like a mother church model. And whether people realize it or not, it's essentially an Anglican form of church government, because you have a church planter who is the most, we could say, educated. He's the most prepared. He has the most ministry experience. And that individual starts a church that they are trying to essentially start other churches out of. But what will end up happening is this church will kind of fund and support those other churches almost indefinitely. And that's a very common model on the mission field. Now, let me ask you a question, just to think about this. In that model, are there any things that you feel perhaps could be violating Scripture or could be not prudent? Or do you think that that model is very sound, very strong, an excellent way to do things? Yeah, go ahead. Yes. Correct. Okay. Yeah, very good. So if I tell someone that Anchor Baptist Church is a self-governing church, but I am being financially supported by someone in Texas, let me ask you, who really controls the church? I mean, being very frank, the person or persons who ultimately control the church are the ones who send the finances, because all they got to do is say, I don't like that decision, and I'm going to cut your support. And if the church doesn't give, and the church have not developed the ability to do it or the conviction to do it, then essentially that is a dictatorship, okay? And it really is an Anglican form of church government. Now, when we talk about Anglican, some people are like, well, you mean you could believe in baptism by immersion of believers and still have an Anglican form of church government? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely you could. Anglican is talking about the structure of the way that the church does its business, okay? If we talk about a Presbyterian form of church government, we're saying that there's a board of elders or trustees, and then there's a pastor who he preaches and they administrate. And the congregation really doesn't have any say in what goes on in the church because they don't make the decisions. The people that make the decisions are the board. Or when we talk about a Baptist church, there are different types of Baptist polities, you might say, but essentially the way that we form is that the congregation is led by the leadership, that's me, and then the men that I work through decisions with. But ultimately, we have business meetings. And so the congregation actually says, yes, that budget, we vote on it. Or yes, we vote on bringing that individual to work at our church. Or yes, we actually are voting on taking on that particular ministry or that missionary or something like that. And so our form of church government is independent, and it's also, it has the potential for us to, let's say there are other Baptist churches in Anne Arundel County and they start going theologically liberal. Well, it doesn't affect our church, okay? I mean, it bothers our church, makes us sad. We probably end up inheriting people that don't want to be in a church that's moving left, okay? I guess left would be this way for me. But we function the way that we function because we make our decisions, we finance our church, we're not dependent on some outside institution. So we fellowship with others, but there's no control from outside. Okay, so that's what we mean by Baptist polity. So when we talk about Baptist churches sending out Baptist missionaries that are planting churches, it wouldn't make a lot of sense for us to essentially get behind what is an Anglican or Presbyterian form of church government. I hope that makes sense. Okay, now I'll give you an example of a situation that I witnessed firsthand. Well, maybe not just one, but I'll only mention it as a generalization. There was an individual, started a church. It was a large church, a strong church. They built a massive building, probably bigger than the congregation, or the room that we're in right now. Maybe not as tall, but yeah, it'd be comparable. And they had a relationship with maybe a dozen or more local men who were pastors. All of those men received support from the mother church entirely, okay? And what's very interesting is that the person who ran the mother church exercised tremendous control on those who are around, But there was a situation where one of those men became disqualified. And the pastor of the mother church said, I'm going to move you to another place. And it created a lot of internal contention, and they essentially forced out the American missionary. That was messy on several different levels. But what it shows you is that there was a power play. Now, when a church is independent, the power play is internal entirely. Okay? If it's a healthy church, then the church functions the way it's supposed to. If the church is unhealthy, then it's going to have internal power plays. And so, like Anchor Baptist Church in Cape Coast, while I love the guys that are there and I do communicate with them, I don't dictate anything to them. We don't financially underwrite them in any way. They're an independent church. And there may be decisions that they make internally that I am so thrilled with, and some that I would go, I wouldn't have done that. But it doesn't matter at this point because I am not the pastor of that church. So that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about this distinction between a mother church model and someone who says, I'm going to go, I'm going to start a church, and my desire is that that church becomes an autonomous church. It is self-governing, it is self-supported, and it is pastored by a local individual. And in my opinion, that would be the most consistent with what is our personal polity as a congregation. Now, on the other side of this, you could have a bit of a middle ground where a church is strong and it says we want to plant other churches, but as we plant other churches, we are helping them become independent, and they will be truly independent. We will not support them down the road. And so that would be kind of almost a middle ground. And so what it shows you is if somebody answers the question, oh, I hold this view, I may ask more questions to find out what they mean by that. And, you know, a person's background is it's gonna affect how they look at those issues. Does that make sense? So, yeah, go ahead.
I just had a question. So, what is your thoughts on someone was starting a church in another country, and then they want to set up another church that they're going to support?
Yep.
Supporting one church or supporting the other. Would you want that pastor to leave that church with somebody local and go help that plant?
Oh, good question. Yeah, great question. Great question. So I asked myself, how would I do it if I was in America, where I am right now? This is what I would envision. I'm not saying this will ever happen, but I'm not saying it won't ever happen too, okay? That if our church had enough members who, in my opinion, were healthy enough that they could be a part of a church start, okay? And if we sent them out, they would not essentially implode our church, okay? In other words, we were strong enough that we could honestly send out a person who's going to pastor a church and even people to help them start that church. Then I would be 100% behind that.
So you're saying somebody would need to be almost pastoral to help start, not just a bunch of great, godly families.
Yeah. Well, okay. So a church needs leadership. Okay, and a church needs leadership in a couple of different ways. A church needs a pastor, okay, because the fact is if a church doesn't have a pastor, that congregation's going to have all kinds of divisions, okay? Even when a church has a pastor and it's very unified, there are different minds in the congregation always. It's impossible for it not to be that way. And so when people have the conviction that as a member of this church, my job is to make sure that the church functions biblically. So if the pastor's getting off track biblically, I'll go and speak to him about it. But on these issues of personal preference, what I think it matters to me, but not to the entire body. On those kinds of issues, what happens is with the leadership, you have unity established. And so if you send out a bunch of people without someone who will lead them, you will probably create an environment where it will become unpastorable over time. So the church has to be strong enough that it has people that could actually legitimately pastor the church. And it also would be great if the church could send out people. And I'll even say that a big factor in why things played out the way they did for me in Ghana is I believe that our church was strong enough and ready to become an independent congregation. I did not believe that the church was strong enough for me to go start another church with some of the key members of the church. I did not believe that. And so that really did shape that particular moment. And for that to happen, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time. It could take decades. It could take, I would say at a minimum, probably 10 years in most situations. Though sometimes a person who has a heart to mentor will attract people who want to be mentored. He didn't lead them to Christ, but he does have a heart for it, and they'll be attracted into a place like that. So a church like ours here could be in a position down the road. We have people that, they're in Bible college, they're in seminary, they do an internship at our church, they didn't get saved in this church, they weren't discipled in this church, but they're getting mentored in this church. And then down the road they say, hey, we feel led of the Lord to plant a church, and that kind of a thing could very easily happen. In fact, I would love to see that happen someday. But you have to have infrastructure, which is leadership and heads of households who are strong enough to lead their own families. I'll use it that way. Yeah, go ahead. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, good. Yeah. Yeah, let me put it this way, Frank. I would say that a school has to be run like a school, and a church has to be run like a church. And if you try to run a school like a church, or you try to run a church like a school, you'll have all kinds of problems, and especially when you put them together. And so, this is a rabbit trail, and I'm not going to go all the way down it, but I'm just going to put that out there as that is my opinion, and that is as someone who grew up in a ministry that was very influential in the Christian school movement and still is, and a part of. In fact, the reason I came to Anchor in 2008 was because I did not feel comfortable with the polity of the church that I grew up in. And I mean, doctrinally, we were pretty much on the same page, but it was not functioning like a Baptist church. It was a campus church. And so I knew going into ministry, I needed to be in a church where I could see the model, live in the model, and practice the model. So I do have some very strong opinions about that issue that are not necessary to lay out at the moment. So we could talk about it later. We got a fellowship after. We could talk about it. So, all right, let me move to our next question. All right. Please explain your approach to funding the work. Okay? Now, let me ask you a question. Should we give our children everything they ask for? Why not? Well, that's true. Huh? You spoil them rotten. Let me ask you a question. At what point in the raising of our children should we make the decision we're not going to give them everything that they ask for? Not when they're 12. You better start that really early, okay? I mean, when you have a child that cannot even talk yet, but they know what they want, you have to learn to start not giving them everything that they ask for. Okay, while that is true, are there times that our children will ask us for things that we absolutely should give them? Of course. Are there times where there are things our children ask us for that it's debatable whether we should or shouldn't? Absolutely it is, okay? And so that principle, we understand it when we're dealing with our children. I think that principle applies to missions. And it is very dangerous for a missionary to establish the pattern, especially in a non-Western culture, especially if there has been a relationship with Western nations that give them handouts every year. Okay, I'll put it that way. We spend a lot of money in the United States of America on foreign aid, a lot of money. There are a lot of trees in Ghana right now down a road I remember driving down that were funded by U.S. aid, okay? Charcoal trees that they cut down and they use for charcoal. Funded by U.S. aid. I remember seeing the sign, driving by going, what a tragedy. There are Planned Parenthood clinics in Ghana that were funded by U.S. money. I've seen the signs. So, question. When it comes to actually supporting a national pastor, do you see how important it is that you're cautious on how you do it? Okay? And let me also say this. There is a sense in which, so an American who is a missionary over in Ghana is going to live much lower, on a much cheaper, lower amount than someone living here in Anne Arundel County, okay? I mean, I think living in Ghana, our monthly support was under $4,000, $3,700, something like that, $3,800. Anybody here, could you laugh off of that? No. You could not. You could not even afford rent and put food on your table at that, let alone drive to work and all those things. Yet you could do that there. Yet at the same time, there are people living in Ghana who maybe lived off of $100 a month. And then you might go, well, hold on a second. Why don't you just live like a Ghanaian? Okay, I will tell you, I was robbed 4 times living in a compound. What do you think would have happened if I lived without a lock on my front door? The idea is that when you send a missionary, you recognize that they're going to have to live at a standard of living that demands more than a local person. But it's a lot less than what you and I live off of here. And sometimes what this does, it complicates how much a person in ministry should be financially underwritten in a context like that. And I'll also add this. There's a great danger that you incentivize people into ministry because of their financial opportunity. In a country like Latin American country, East Asian country, African country, you have to be so very, very cautious. And so with that in mind, you have to understand that the question of do we support nationals, how much do we support them, when do we support them, and all those things, they are very, very complicated questions. And I've seen the difficult end result of not thinking that through carefully. So yeah, go ahead. What's your question? Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, very good. So let me I'll use this illustration, and I've had a lot of conversations with missionaries while I lived on the field. I would use the word debates, okay, because they were very much debates on how we looked at this issue. And when I asked this question, did Paul have a single way that he was supported when he did his missions work? Did he have a single way? No, he didn't. Can anybody share one or two of the ways that we know that he did this? He was bivocational, okay. What do you say? Yeah. Yeah. So were there ever times that Paul had the right to be supported by a church and he refused it? Yeah. Why did he do that? Yeah, so yeah, you guys are saying the same thing. So there was a situation where the Apostle Paul, when he was working at Corinth, he said to them, in fact, we can read it right out of the text. He said, I robbed churches. That's the term he used. I robbed churches because they supported me when you were supposed to support me. but I would not allow you to support me because of how you view that relationship. That is essentially the quick and dirty explanation of what the Apostle Paul said. What that tells you is that Paul was not fixed on one particular way, nor would he say, okay, in this situation, I would always do it this way. In this situation, I would never do it this way. He made it very clear that the church was responsible to support those who minister to them in the word. Yet he also made it very clear that he did not want that church to have a wrong view of their relationship because of financial partnership. And so what it tells you is that Paul, he thought carefully about this issue as well. And so I'm just going to tell you what we did when we were in Ghana. And I feel that it was probably a very prudent thing. And it was not something that started with me. The truth is that this approach was actually, it began with others. You know, Micah and other people who I was friends with. What we did when we were working with an individual was we encouraged them to be bivocational. We encouraged them to develop skills so that they could support their family, and so that when the church was not financially strong enough to support them, they could support themselves. Yet as the church began to become stronger, there would be a point where the church would recognize their need to support their pastor. And it was all done entirely on the local level. And we also encouraged them to partner in teams so that the ministry load could sort of be a little bit lightened because they were a team. And what that did is that allowed us to be in the position that we are today. Yet there were also individuals in the States who underwrit entirely local men. And not only did they underwrite local men, but they went to churches where people were working and ministering and serving, and they encouraged them to partner in their ministry so that they had financial resources, which ultimately would pull them out of the church they were serving in. You can only imagine how that would have made that church feel. And what it ultimately did is it made them bound in conscience to those who supported them. It was a very messy scenario. And so as we, started that particular approach, we tried very hard to begin at the beginning by saying, this is what we're going to do from the start. Now, I'm also going to say this. I also think that in the same way that as our children, they get older and they should not be dependent on us, but sometimes they need help getting started out in life, I think it's very wise for a parent to say, hey, son, I see that you're responsible and I see that you're struggling and I want to help you with this here today. This is not going to be a long-term thing, but I want to help you buy your first house. So I'm going to give you this chunk of money so that you can do that. You didn't ask for it. You don't demand it. This is not a loan. I'm giving it to you. I know that working your way through college is going to be a struggle, and you're going to have to work your way through college. But if you get through 3 years, I'm paying for year 4. Does the Bible tell us to do that? No. But you know what it does do? It shows you as a parent, you're responsible for your kids, not just in shaping them as they get ready to go into life, but to help them to be successful when they enter into adult life. And those are judgment calls that we have to make. And so in the same way that we understand those principles when we're working with our own children, I think that we have to bring those into those contexts as well, because these are our spiritual children. These are the people we've led to Christ, we've discipled, we've mentored them. And there are also times where you look at the financial strength. For instance, the situation in Ghana. When we were there, at the very beginning of the time we were there, the difference between the dollar and the CD was only, I think it was 1.5 Ghana cedis for $1 US. When we left, it was 3.5 Ghana cedis to $1 US. Today, it's 13 Ghana cedis to $1 US. So you just think about it this way. If that church has been faithfully giving and putting their money into a bank account, they have essentially been taking that money and throwing it in a trash can and burning it. I mean, just being totally blunt about it, because inflation has completely eaten their resources. And so I think in situations like that where we're not asked, we're not demanded, it's not expected, we go, we can help these people, let's do that. And that's the great value of a church in the United States being able to, send love gifts and get behind, a church planter who has a great need for a building. He hasn't asked us for this. He doesn't demand it. This doesn't come with any strings attached. But we say, we're going to help you in this situation. To me, those things are very, very good, but they're things that they're challenging. There's a lot of nuance to these situations. I hope that makes sense. So, again, you may go to another context where being bivocational doesn't work. Someone might say, well, why doesn't a missionary be bivocational? Well, in some countries you can be bivocational, and in others you cannot be bivocational. And a lot of it depends on your visa status and all those kinds of things. So these are very difficult questions that don't have simple, easy, straightforward answers sometimes when we're dealing with them. But I want to know, has this guy who says he's ready to go to the field, has he thought about this at all? Is this on his radar? Has he talked to anybody about it? Has he read anything that's been written about this? Because if he hasn't, he's going to spend 5 to 10 years learning everything the hard way, and then maybe he quits, or maybe he gets on track, but he looks at that time period and he says, I wish I could have learned that before I went to the field. It would have saved me a lot of waste. Okay? Will you encourage your church to support itself from the start? And again, that kind of falls under the category of what I was getting at there. Okay? Any questions here? Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Interesting side note to this
Yeah.
idea. When I was going to Japan for work, I attended a church that was started by an American missionary
Yeah.
in Japan.
Uh-huh.
It was largely Japanese people in the church, but some international people. That church, it really struck me at first that church supported a missionary to the United States. And at first I had a hard time getting my head wrapped around it, but I liked it because it was.
Yeah.
It showed that they had a heart for missions and
Yeah.
supporting. And it's just interesting how the Lord can work different things out
Yeah.
such that His plan is accomplished, but through a wacky way sometimes.
Yeah.
Americans supporting an American and Japanese supporting the Japanese.
Yeah. So let me put out, I'll get your question in a second. Let me put out a principle that works in every culture, okay? If 10 gainfully employed people in your church believe in the tithing principle and they do it faithfully, then the median income of those 10 family units or individuals will be what they're able to give to a pastor, okay? 10 families, 10 individuals. So these people could be, poor. They could be very middle class. They could be extremely wealthy. They could be somewhere in the middle. 10 families. It could be 10 singles, to be very honest. But 10 giving families or individuals who believe in the tithing principle can support a pastor. Okay? That's true in Germany. That's true in the United States. That's true in Russia. Well, I don't know what it'd be like right now. That is true in any context, okay? And the problem is that a lot of people are not taught to give, or a lot of people are taught to give and they just don't do it, or they do it very inconsistently. But if people actually practice that, the church can be supported in such a way. Okay? But it may take a long time for a church plant to get to the place where it has 10 individuals or families who have that conviction and faithfully do it. And that's why if you're starting another church and you're actually sending somebody out, it would be really helpful to them if you could actually send people out that have such a conviction, because it will help them get quicker to that point. So that's just a practical note to think about. So there was a question. Yeah, right there. Go ahead. Yeah. 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 So I'll give you a funny example. So when we were in Ghana, we could not be gainfully employed because of the way our visa was set up, but we were not called missionaries. We were on what was called an NGO visa, okay? So we established an organization called the Anchor Baptist Mission, and the Anchor Baptist Mission's mission was to do education and development within the community. So I coached wrestling at a college, okay? I ran a tournament between 4 male dormitories. It was pretty intense. We taught music lessons out of a resource center. We established a library. The library is still there. I taught Bible Institute classes. I went and I taught in schools around the area. And every year, someone from the local assembly would sit down with me, and I had to write a report, and they asked me questions about that. They wanted to see the places that I'd been, and they wanted to see pictures of some of the things that I was involved in. So what you see is that I couldn't be gainfully employed, but I had to be doing something that they were going to actually look at. And that's just that context. Every situation is going to be slightly different. But yes, some places a person goes a missionary, they can be registered as a missionary. They may have to pay taxes to the local government and the national government, and they'll have to do it here as well, or they may not have to. They may be required to employ a certain number of people in their organization, and so there are a lot of details that can change every year as well. So yeah, go ahead. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Very good. Okay, I'm going to skip this next one because I've kind of already developed it as far as developing it more. Will you encourage your churches in the States to fund major projects? If so, to what extent should the nationals be involved? And this next question, I think, is an important one as well. And I've sort of touched on it, but I want you to tell me maybe what you've picked up from this discussion, or just think about it yourself. What marks of maturity in the church will you be watching that indicate that the church plant is ready to be a self-supported, self-governing local church? And this actually is a very important question when it comes to missions. Yeah, I'll read it again. I'm sorry. What marks of maturity in the church will you be watching that indicate that the church plant is ready to be a self-supported, self-governing local church? Or a bivocational pastor. That's another, yeah, but yeah, you're right about that, absolutely. So if your pastor's not bivocational and the church does not have 10 people regularly tithe, then how is this guy going to feed his family? He can't do it, okay? He's going to have, there's going to have to be a judgment call. So that very practical thing, yeah, back there. Yeah. But that would be assuming that you have a children's Sunday school class. But no, it's, yeah. Yeah, no, you're right, yeah. Yeah. So how do you make that judgment? Go ahead, Frank, and then Doug, yeah.
Well, I think if they're actually doing that now,
Yeah.
I mean, if that's what they want to do, and they
Yeah.
have the desire to support their pastor to be independent and they're faithful in that regard.
So let me counter with a question here, Frank, too, to think about, because that's a great point. So let's say that they're not doing it. Is it possible that you could come to the conclusion that maybe they're not doing it because you're filling the gap for them?
The thought in my mind is that they should be eager and they should be chomping at the bit
Yeah,
to be able to do that, and that's what they should want to do.
absolutely. Yeah. And there's some nuance to this question, but one of the things that a missionary has to ask is, am I keeping people from doing things that they're capable of doing? Are they not motivated because I'm taking that motivation away? And I mean, this is true like when we're raising our children. So like, if you're washing the dishes for your kid, doing their laundry, you're getting their clothes ready every day, you walk into their room and you wake them up and you literally do everything for them and they're 16 years old. And you're upset that they are not motivated. Don't you think you should step back and say, is it because I'm creating that? I mean, just being very frank. I mean, what would happen if you stopped doing those things? And the challenge is that once we have created dependency and we have created an attitude of entitlement, we've got to somehow figure out how to wean them off of that. And so we really have to start making decisions long in advance before we're to that stage so that we make sure that people are beginning to develop these convictions and this way of thinking. They're doing it themselves. And so really what I would say is, do you have heads of households that actually lead their family in family worship? Do you have men in the church that you could actually turn over a Sunday school class and you could walk away from it and not be terrified of what they're going to say? Do you have men that are qualified to be deacons? Do you have men that when you work through difficult situations, they are contributing, and if you weren't in the room, they wouldn't even need you to make the decision? These are the kinds of questions I think that we should be kind of asking ourselves. And when a missionary starts realizing there are families here, heads of households are serious-minded people, they are actually leading their families. There are men in this church who could actually function as deacons. There is at least an individual who could pastor this church, and there are men who could actually teach Sunday school, and they could be trusted to do that. And when it comes to delicate issues, you know by the conversations you have with them that their convictions are going to lead them to a high view of Scripture, and they're not going to cave and compromise on those issues. A missionary needs to get out of that church. They need to leave it to be independent. Now, I don't mean just like stand up one day and say, oh, I'm done with the church. You guys are ready to roll. Go for it. I'm not saying that. No, you sit down and you say, hey, this is the sense that I'm getting. This is the sense that I'm getting. And here's the process of how we're going to go through this. That's what you want to do. And when missionaries do that, the nationals, the people who are part of that church, when that missionary goes, they will continue. They will do even better because at some point he starts holding them back. Okay? He had to go there, but if he stays there indefinitely, he holds them back. It's like somebody who's raising a 40-year-old and they're continuing to make their bed for them and do their laundry and all those things. Like, what a terrible thing to do, But we do that in missions. So, Doug, and then I'll come up here. You had one? Oh, he got it? Okay. Perfect. All right. Scott.
I was going to say, but if you wait till you have certainty on all these questions, you'll never do it.
Yes. And so they're like I say, it's very subjective. And it may be that God will do something when you are starting to wonder that will push you to make that decision. Many times he'll do that. And that sometimes it's a missionary getting sick and they have to come off the field. And the only way that they would have come off the field is their health broke, and so God allows their health to break so that the church will go. You say, I'm serious, it's true. Sometimes the government shuts the door and they can't get their visa. And, they're frustrated and they've gone through every single possible way to get their visa and it's been shut down. And so God has his ways too. Even, in our reluctance or in our uneasiness, it's not like God's like, oh, my hands are tied, I don't know what to do because this missionary just can't get the point. God can say, all right, I'm sovereign. I can make this happen if I need to. And he will. So, how do you plan to support pastors trained in your ministry? That kind of goes to that other piece. And then, do you see yourself as a long-term or short-term missionary? How a person answers that question is very nuanced. And I'm not looking for like a very specific answer. I'm looking for an answer that gives me insight into the way that they think. How will you know when your work in a particular church is completed? So all of those things are things that give us insight into whether or not this person is really thinking practically about how to do this work. You know what I've learned? What I've learned is that people that grow up in Christian homes, go to Christian school, and have never worked a real job in the real world and do not have a family, they have a much harder time with these issues than someone who got saved when they're 40. Lived their whole life in the secular world and they can think practically about life. I'm just being frank about that. Sad but true, okay? And maybe it's because the way that we are raising the next generation in those very controlled environments is not as healthy as we think that it is. So just throwing that out there. All right, we got 5 minutes. Any other questions? I'm going to stop here. We're going to go to part 4 next week. But, you know, I think it's important for us to think about this. And I think that there's a lot of insight. When we're looking at, I'll get to your question in a second. When we're looking at an issue, sometimes the way you can evaluate the principles that apply in this context is to step in another context that is parallel and apply those principles and ask what happens. It's very helpful. Because if we see what happens in this context, we go, well, wouldn't I expect the same kind of thing to happen here? And the answer is you would. And you'll see it. You will see it happen. And so, very, very important. All right, you had a question back there? It is or isn't? Oh, it is. Yeah, go ahead.
We've had all this discussion about we want to support, primarily church planting,
Yep.
missionaries. What is the nature of our relationship with Maranatha? Like, do we financially send the money every month as an educational institution?
That's a fair question. I didn't make that decision, okay? But I'm not against the decision, okay? And I would say that there are missionaries that we support that we would put them in helps categories. They are overseeing institutions that are doing a great work. But if I was looking at the situation going, would I want to take on a Maranatha? And it's not just specific to Maranatha. I like Maranatha, okay? Yeah, I would be a lot more, compelled to say, well, perhaps you need to just make sure that what you charge your students is what can pay your bills. I mean, that's the way I'm most inclined on that. But we do have missionaries, and this is real common, and we always kind of debate on how do we handle those things. But we've even had these internal discussions very recently, I'll be honest. So we have an individual, they have been a church planting missionary. Part of being a church planting missionary is that you are training people to go into ministry. And so a lot of what you do once you have people that you're working with is you're training the future leadership of those churches. Well, sometimes those people come off the field. It could be their age. It could be their health. It could be the situations going on in that country. And they don't technically leave missionary status, but their missionary status is different than when it started. And we always, have a hard time knowing what's the best way to handle those situations. And so what we have done at times is that sometimes with a person like that, we will not end their support, but we will reduce it so that it would be like what we do with Maranatha or one of these other institutions, if that makes sense. Yeah. But as a pastor, I've seen pastors, they take over, they come into a role and they just cut all their missionaries. We're going to start over from scratch. Like, why would you do that? Like, the people in the church made a decision to take those people on. And if you have such a conviction that you can't support that, then you probably shouldn't pastor that church, just being very frank. But there are times where you go, I don't know that I would have taken on that person. I would not have pushed to take on that individual. Or I would have not pushed to take on that institution. But I don't think that it's violating some principle that is hard and fast. And so I will continue. And I don't see any problem with doing that, if that makes sense. But you won't see a new institution of the same kind being presented. Yeah. And some might not even realize it. They're like, well, I've never seen us take on a college or Bible college, whatever. And that would be the real reason, so.
Just to add historical context to her question.
Yeah.
The Maranatha, for a long time, would send 2 or 3 times a year, would send faculty
Yeah.
to Anchor, and they would teach courses.
Yeah, that's a great point. So our relationship with the school over the years has been that they actually sent professors over for modular type classes, and we would have classes for a whole week. We did that. Obviously, the Lit Conference, they come in. So we have had a very long-standing relationship with them, and unless their institution became, in my view, unsupportable because of their theological changes, I wouldn't do that. Yeah, that's true. Good point. Thank you for that. I know that, but it wasn't in my head. Go ahead. Oh boy. All right. We'll go as is on this one.
So like mission boards or whoever's doing it, and like these pastors are going around and doing deputation, missionaries, potential missionaries, and they are getting at 80% of their support level or whatever.
You're talking about missionaries or mission board? Oh, the missionaries themselves. Okay, yeah.
Getting their support.
Yeah.
So is that support, is that like something like, it seems in my mind that support level for where they're going, that should be something like about a 10 family, it should be a 10% of whatever the need. And is it that way? And if not, do you think it should be?
Well, what I can say is that there are certain considerations that have to be made for a foreigner living in another culture that are not made by a person who lives locally there, okay? And one is that there are expectations that people in the States are going to want to see that missionary. And so if you live in a place where it's $2,500 a ticket to fly back to America and you have a family of 8, well, let's say you have a family of 4. We'll just go with that one. That's a lot of money. And the question is, how do they have that money available? Well, they're going to have to save during the years of being on the field so that they can financially pay for that trip. Or if you're a foreigner and you live in a neighborhood, you will have people knock on your door every single day asking you to support them financially for school, a medical thing, every single day. I actually disconnected my doorbell. I'm serious, I did. I disconnected my doorbell and I put a little switch there so that I would only have my doorbell on at certain hours of the day because my child woke up from their nap every single day because people would ring the bell when they were napping, or someone would ring the bell at 5 o'clock in the morning and wake up the whole household. And you don't have to deal with that here in the States. You have situations where you have to have security. You have to pay someone, possibly armed, to secure your location, because if you don't, you will be robbed a lot. And not just they'll take your stuff, but it's not safe for your family. And I could tell you some pretty amazing stories of people held at gunpoint, beaten, shot at, who said, man, I'm going to live like a local man and family, and I don't need to have walls. I don't need to do all these things. And their family fell apart as a result of what happened. I could tell you a lot of stories of people who suffered immensely. So there are certain considerations that we have to consider. It's not that simple. So just putting that out. But all right, I'm going to have to close it because of the time. But we will get into how much people raise, Lord willing, next week. So let's pray. Father, thank you for this time of discussion. A lot of important things for us to think about, and help us as a church just to be knowledgeable about missions, to understand why we do it the way we do it. Help us to think practically and help us be unified as a body. And I pray for our missionaries. I'm so thankful for those who we support, their wonderful partnerships, and I pray that we would really bless them and that they would be faithful. Bless our service, and we ask it all in Christ's name. Amen. All right, you're dismissed.